Blog Talk Radio. Welcome to the Dark Matters radio show with the Sorceress Cagliastro, blood sorceress, pioneer, and necromancer in the hands of nine, for a discussion on all topics relating to blood sorcery, necromancy, the science of sorcery, and related work of manipulation of energy. Each week, the Sorceress Cagliastro and Chris Rogostrowski will explore topics designed to reveal what cannot be seen. Tonight's topic is sense and the use of sense in sorcery. Tonight we have a special guest, Darren Allen White, who is a sorcerer, teacher, and master perfumer. His experience walking spiritual and magical paths for over 25 years, combined with being a classically French-trained perfumer, gives him a unique perspective when working to create custom fragrances for individual clients, as well as the cosmetic and personal care industry. And, of course, we also have a special guest for part of the show, or maybe all of the show tonight, Victor Furman. Victor is an interfaith minister, spiritual channel, author, and paranormal investigator who is currently on 2 investigation teams in New York. Join us in the Dark Matter chat room, which you can find on the Blog Talk radio page if you scroll down. And now, here is the Sorceress Cagliastro and Chris Rogostrowski.
Good evening. Thank you. Hi, Chris. How are you tonight?
Oh, not bad. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for bringing us in, Mary. I want to welcome Victor. Victor's a voice Furman, a friend of mine, a man whose opinion I greatly respect. And thank you for joining us tonight, Victor.
Thank you for having me.
Sure, of course. We want you here as often as you possibly can tolerate the extra burden of coming to chat with us once a week for 2 hours. And Darren Allen White, a man whose work is beyond extraordinary, and thank you for coming to spend time with us tonight, Darren.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I want to say a little bit about Darren's work so that he can blush in the privacy of his own home. He is truly does not carry lightly the term master perfumer. When I met Darren, I had an idea about something called iron, which is, this is how I work. I say, hey, I have an idea, and then people help me make that possible. And the idea was having an experience of olfactory triggers where one could create something and touch it upon their skin and bring them to a place in sorcery that is unique to the experience of understanding and identifying scent. And we kicked this around a little bit, and he said, oh, this, and provided a magnificent elixir that is some wonderful meeting of what it would smell like, and I don't even know, saying smell like barely even gives credence to the amazement of this thing, when blood hits iron. And it is just so extraordinary, and he'll talk about the tones of it and all of that business. But what happens is you have the experience of this elixir, and you are in the presence of blood on iron. So tonight, I think, in tandem of discussing scents, what we are really going to be exploring is what scents do to our minds and the triggers that scents create. Darren, can I introduce you, and can you talk a little bit about iron? And we're going to talk about it a lot tonight, but just give us a lead-in to how you found it.
Sure. You and I had spoken about creating a scent for use in blood sorcery. And, what better scent to start with than iron? That's the foundation of the work. What's interesting about this is that, even though I do classic perfumes, I've always been sort of off the center, looking for odd and unusual things to do. So this was a perfect challenge for me when you put it to me. What came out of this is really, like you said, an olfactory trigger. It's not a perfume. It's not the typical magical oil that you would buy at your local occult shop or one of the online occult superstores, on the internet. It's a highly specialized sorcery tool. And it was created, in concept from the beginning, concept to finish, for the Sorceress Cagliastro, and specifically for use in blood sorcery. And I think anyone who smells it can attest to the fact that, there's nothing else out there like this. It's very unique, and it's a sorcery tool.
The only other thing out there like this is if I actually bleed onto iron.
Yeah.
And and you know, as it is that specific, it is that amazing. You know, I think that the concept of sorcery at the level of scent is most interesting. When I teach, what I try to do is connect all the dots. I'll start a class talking about one bizarre little piece of what feels like sorcery minutia, if such a thing exists, and go all the way around 2 hours later and hook it all together, and it makes sense. But the thing about scents is that we don't discuss them that often, and we talk about what we see and what we hear, what we feel, and we talk about what baits the disincarnate, what intrigues demons, what creates a lineup of the information from the weight of thoughts and intentions in our mind and striking the target. We talk about all of that. But scent is the thing that, and, you know, I'd love to hear everybody's opinion on this, scent is the thing we remember. We remember what somebody's house smelled like. We remember, you know, what perfume a lover was wearing. We remember even the distasteful scents, the things that make us stand back for a moment and say, oh, I remember that, you know, and that was scary or that was difficult to encounter. So let's start there. Anybody want to take that?
Well, I know when my uncle died, I knew he was around just because of the tobacco smell that I smelled, because he had a special blend that he made himself from a couple different packets, and that was the only one I smelled that smelled like that, and that's one of the keys that I remember as far as he goes. Same way if I'd want to, you know, try to communicate with him, that's what I would focus on because that's what I remember. And you're right, that's a bigger trigger than pretty much anything else is because there's so much attached to it. You know, everybody knows what the house smelled like on a Sunday afternoon. I mean, I know what it was like when I walked in from church. I knew what the hell my aunt's house smelled like. I mean, I still do now, and I'm 50 years old. And I haven't been in a church since, you know.
Yes, we've heard that about you, Chris. And it's
for their own good.
Well, everybody's safer in that way. You know, and I want everybody to talk about this, but I just want to mention that I'd like to sort of gravitate back and forth between scents that trigger us, what scents do for us, scents that are created, and also the experience of being told what scents are supposed to do for us and when they don't, because Darren brought up commercial occult oils. And to keep in mind what Chris mentioned, which was the scent that is attached to, that a disincarnate brings with them. Victor, you want to chime in on this?
Well, interestingly enough, Chris, my dad was a cigar smoker, and he died when I was 14. And whenever he's present, I smell those cigars, and it's in houses that no one's ever smoked in, so it's very interesting. And usually he comes when I have a question that I'm having difficulty processing. And I smell that cigar smoke, and I know it's him. But, you know, the power of scent is really interesting. There just happened to be a news story today that I overheard, and I made notes on it, about an Ohio woman who lives in a retirement home, and she had her 100th birthday today, and she had one wish for her birthday. She wanted to do yard work and especially smell fresh-cut grass. The woman, Trudy Price of Bowling Green, was given her wish with the help of the grounds crew at the Bowling Green State University. They helped her push one of the university's mowers and then helped her plant some flowers near the student union. And she got her wish, which was being able to smell fresh-cut grass. Imagine being 100 years old and your biggest wish is to be able to cut and smell fresh grass. Isn't that beautiful?
It is beautiful. It also goes to the core of the human experience, because scent leads us to where we live. It leads us to where we have memories that are so pure, crystal clear, more so than any other of the senses. Victor, do you have any experience around when you're dealing with people who are approaching becoming disincarnate, because I know you do a lot of that work? Do they have any requests that come up for you, or can you attach that to scent in any way? Does that really happen?
I haven't had that specific experience with people who were conscious prior to transition, but I have on a number of occasions had a floral fragrance with people who were unconscious. There were no flowers in the room. And close to transition, there would be a very strong floral scent in the room.
Well, that's an interesting thing because I speak to a lot of disincarnates from the Victorian and Edwardian periods. I don't know why specifically, but I would say more so from those periods than from any other. And, the Victorians were obsessed with death. And by obsessed with, I mean exploring it in every way they possibly could figure out how to do. And there were rooms where people were laid out because they were very concerned about being buried alive. Apparently this was a real vital pulse in the subculture of being concerned about or learning about or experiencing death and talking about death in public in a way that they hadn't before. And there were these rooms where they would lay people out on tables surrounded with flowers in a heavy way to wait out to see if they started to decompose before burying them. And this happened because once obviously someone's decomposed, they're no longer alive. And there would be people whose job, unfortunately, because it was Victorian times, often the children of the poor, who would sit there and who would wait. And if a body moved, they would report it. Otherwise, they would just, they would report when someone's skin had turned black or they had started to decompose. But the scent of flowers was used to try to quell the meerkaps, which is the elements that decompose. So Victorian way of death really presented to the human consciousness the connection between flowers and the experience of death. I think that has a lot to do with it. I have my grandmother, who, for me the question of lineage is always an interesting one, but the person I identify as my grandmother, she always comes with a scent of roses in a powerful way because she kept them in her house. She used the oil. She was always very involved in that. So I often smell that when she comes into my presence. Mary, Darren, anybody have any comments about the disincarnate incense?
Yeah, I do. I have some thoughts and experience with it. There are several ways that you can use scent in sorcery, and one of those ways is to trigger the disincarnate and to come into your experience. And this, as you know, can be done by baiting them with blood, but I've also had success with baiting them with other preferred materials which they have some sort of attachment to from when they were alive, like the smell of a favorite food or a drink or a favorite perfume can sometimes be used to catch their attention. And I think it has to do with, when I think of dealing with the disincarnate, the word that always comes to mind with that is nostalgia, because they seem to be very nostalgic about the memories and the attachments that they had from when they were living. I was just wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Well, Darren, that's really powerful what you just said, and we've talked endlessly about how to bait the disincarnate. But I have a question for you. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's relevance? Because you know how I always say that thoughts, intentions, ideas have physical weight. For you, the work of scent is a very big part of your life.
Right.
So do you think that perhaps your connection, commitment, involvement with scent makes that a way for you to bait the disincarnate and makes that more powerful for you than, say, for example, for me, which is more specifically blood?
I do feel that it is, for me, a sort of a portal that is easily accessible to me because it is such a big trigger with me. So I guess that's a good question. Now you're making me wonder whether the trigger is actually triggering the disincarnate or if it's it's triggering something within me to open up that, that portal so that I can more easily experience them.
Well, that's my job. When I teach the work, and I talk about it, what my intention is always is to say to someone, point out something that they have that particularly hones a particular direction. and in your case, sense being so much a part of your existence, then maybe it has something to do with your own personal triggers and your ability to convey that, because your intention and thoughts about sense are obviously more powerful than, or at least more present, let me say, than it might be for others.
Right.
Mary,
that makes sense.
Mary, you have any thoughts on this?
Well, no, I was just thinking about, I've had people come to me that have lost a spouse, and, one of the things that I think just listening to what we've been talking about so far is to maybe, tell folks to use a scent that would bring that person closer to them, like a perfume or, smell of cooking, a certain scent of, like sauce or lasagna or something like that, to bring them closer. Because people say, how can I communicate with them? And I don't think I've ever really explored scents before until we started talking about it. We were talking about doing the show. So I think it's a very valuable tool that one is not utilized and one that's not utilized that much.
Do you think that different cultures have a greater or lesser appreciation of how scents work in the disincarnate? Because, I was a licensed funeral director, and I'll tell you that the American way of death is perhaps the most sterile of all ways of death. I mean, you look at us and then you look at other countries where funerals and wakes and whatnot become sort of celebratory in a different way, and then you go all the way to sky burial where a shaman has to create breaks in the body, in the vessel, so that birds take away the flesh. So there is such a broad chasm of how people deal with death from one culture to another. And to me, Americans clean it all up. We embalm with a liquid that has pigment in it so that we can try to keep the body looking as alive as possible. We sterilize everything. We don't even allow for the closing of caskets with flowers in them. So it's a very sterile experience here in America. So I'm wondering if Mary, we both come from a similar culture, if you think that some cultures have more weight in the scent area when it comes to the disincarnate than others.
I think so. I mean, I think, I was just thinking about, a lot of stuff that's been placed into caskets at, funerals that I've been at, and some of it's alcohol and some of it's, roses. I've actually seen roses go into a casket. And I think there are other cultures that don't have such a restriction to it. But I think that you're right. That's why we're not familiar, because everything has to be very sterile and smell very clean almost, or just, that smell that goes up your nose that you just want to get rid of. And I think if we used more of those triggers, then we would communicate with them even better.
I have something interesting to say about human decomposition and the scent and what that is. When I was at the chief medical examiner's office, we had a specific room just for what we called, the decomps. And these are people who, in their experience of death, were not found right away and had an extraordinary burden of scent that they brought with them. And this is something that a living human being will never, ever, ever forget. So I thought about what I could do with that. And you almost memorize it. It comes with you. Once you've smelled it, it sticks with you forever. And what I started to use that for was to work with finding the body of missing and deceased individuals. And I allowed myself to connect to that sense of decomposition when dealing with their communication to me and combining those things. And on occasion, it will help me actually locate the body or have an understanding of where the body is. So these are profound uses of scent. Victor, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I had lived in Korea for 2 years, 1975 and 1976, and at that time, the Korean culture has had a tendency to trend toward Christianity, but in those days it was predominantly Buddhist. And I had attended a couple of Buddhist funerals, and Buddhist funerals are filled with all kinds of glorious floral scents and incense, and ultimately the body is cremated. In the process of cremation, there's essential oils that are used and other beautiful fragrances in the cremation process. The other thing about the Korean culture, and I think this probably lends itself to other Buddhist cultures in Asia, is that on the anniversary of the person's birthday, they will set out an altar with the person's favorite food, some artifacts that may belong, jewelry or some kind of memento that used to belong to the person in life, and also burn incense and have photographs of the person who was disincarnate. And this is, in their minds at that time, this was to honor the person and the memory of the person. But I also wonder how much of that brings the spirit of the disincarnate back.
Well, I would assume, given that work is something that I do quite a bit of, that is essentially opening a temporary portal, bringing them in, offering them a memory attached to various moments of their life, and allowing them to participate in the ongoing caring for them. You know, one of the things that I talked about, I think, in the first Blood Sorcery Bible was the temporary portal, opening a temporary portal, and that's a good way to learn to open larger portals or to be comfortable around the disincarnate, is to bait them, and if that word makes anyone uncomfortable, then step back for a minute and think about it as just a functional term, and how that reminds them of their physicality, of their human experience, of what it means to be part of a communication with a living human being. So, you know what, Victor, I would guess that there is not only a presence of them, but an expectation of a presence of them, even if it's not spoken about. Is it a culture that is open to that sort of thing?
It was at the time. Like I said, there's been a trend toward Christianity in that area of the world and several other of the Northern Asian countries. But at the time, it was very, very, I would say at the time it was probably 90% Buddhist population in there. So
as they turn to Christianity, they turn away from those very sort of visceral, truthful experiences that has to do, not that Christianity isn't truthful for some people, I guess it is, but they turn away from the visceral, more truthful experiences that belong to their culture. And I think go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please, go ahead.
I think basically is that in their adoption of Christianity, and especially Western Christianity, there's a tendency to leave the old culture behind.
You know, that's interesting because I'm Sicilian, and we were pretty much forbidden from speaking Italian in the house when I was a kid because it was all about assimilate. But the interesting thing about that is until somebody dies, and then everybody gets all who they are, you know, all the Sicilian comes out. And it is popular in that culture to bring food in massive, possibly more food than any 1,000 people could eat, you know, for 10 or 12 people who are. You know that story, Mary. But the scent of that food, the scent of that gathering, it's something that sticks with me. You know, I remember those kinds of experiences, being attached to that, and being sort of like, oh, you want to say, oh, it must be awake. You know, I'm smelling everybody's sauce. So this kind of thing is very important. Mary, do we have any questions in the chat room?
We do, and I actually thought this one was very interesting. So what if you know, in your magical practices, whatever that is, you're told to use a certain scent and you absolutely hate the smell of it?
That's very interesting. Who wants to take that first? Chris, maybe?
Well, and the way I am, I pretty much do, you know, whether it's good or bad, I do what I have to do in the situation. I mean, when you know this as well as I do, if you're around a dead body, you're around a bad scent to begin with, and if they're burned, it's twice as bad.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And, you know, so to have to use something, I mean, if it calls for using skunk oil, chances are you got to use it. I mean, there's a reason that you're using that as a trigger. If it's not for you, maybe it's for the one that you're trying to get a hold of. I mean, you know, maybe he was sprayed by a skunk before he died, and that's the last damn thing he remembers. I mean, you don't know what the purpose is. You just know you have to do it.
Well, there's two levels of validation here, though. It has a lot to do with who's telling you need those oils. That's the first thing. And the second
if
thing
it's just
is,
some schmuck on the street, I ain't going. It's one thing if the family's telling me, hey, you've got this is their favorite smell, and I'm going, oh, geez, my great grandmother used to like Limburger and onion sandwiches. Well, did you ever smell that?
Yes, well, my husband's British. He eats Stilton. Yes, I am familiar with the experience.
So you know what that smells like.
Yes, I do.
Unfortunately, that's a trigger for my grandmother because that was one of her favorite meals. Some Joe Schmo comes off the street and no, there ain't no way. And if it comes out of a book of somebody that I would take it all with a grain of salt.
Well,
it's got to have a little.
Yeah, but if it comes with something that you're not sure about in terms of a history, there's endless stuff written, as you all know. And if it comes with somebody sort of scraping things together and creating a codex or some kind of rehashed business of various rituals and whatnot, then you have to always second guess those kinds of things. I think that it's very important to be comfortable in the moment as well with your own triggers. Sometimes disgusting scents are meant to trigger this kind of chaos. A very ugly scent can put you in the chaos void or in the static practice. Darren, what do you think about that?
So I agree. I have two thoughts on the matter. One, getting back to the point that was made about looking things up in a book. I know that there's the Scott Cunningham Encyclopedia of magical herbs and oils, and you're supposed to use certain oils and certain plants with certain planets on certain days. And and that's fine, and if that is something that means something to you and that's a trigger for you, then I say go with it. But everybody has their own individual triggers. One person may love the smell of rose, and it may bring about feelings of romance and love and, close relationships. And then so it may remind someone else of, a family member's funeral. And it may have a bad, a negative connotation. So I think
that's my point. That's my point, Darren. That's what I want to hear from you about, is because these kinds of olfactory triggers are so vital. And what do you think happens to a ritual if you don't like the pieces of the ritual itself? What happens to the ritual if you're uncomfortable with the scents?
Right. Yeah, it could pull you out of the the static practice and pull you out of it. On the other hand, it may be an opportunity for you to explore why you have an aversion to a certain scent.
Sure.
And
sure.
what attachment you have to that. It may be an opportunity to free yourself from a limitation in some way as well.
Darren, when you work with scents, are there things that you personally find to become, and this is the best way I can phrase this, boring? That they lose their connection with the sense of trigger? Does that happen?
You know what? I really cannot say that it does. And this is just me speaking personally from my own experience, but everything that I smell has something associated with it. Mm-hmm. And, it could be a memory, it could be, taking me back to a certain place and time. And what's interesting, too, is, and this gets into the whole idea of the limbic system and the limbic brain, and I don't want to get too much into the technical aspect of that, but, there are portions of the brain, like the hippocampus, for example, which is a portion of the limbic brain, which is the primal, ancient part of the brain that deals with emotions and, the secretion of hormones and also memories. And this is what I really find interesting, is that the hippocampus acts as a sort of filing cabinet of sorts for memories. Mm. So if you have an experience that could be triggered by a scent, it is placed somewhere in the correct hemisphere for later recall. So when you smell something in the future, and we've all had similar experiences with this, just in in dealing with memory. You may be having lunch with a friend or be traveling and be on a trip somewhere on vacation, and something will trigger you, and it will trigger a memory that happened maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago that up until that point in time, for all intents and purposes, you have forgotten about. And so where does that memory come from?
Well, Darren, I think that it's a very well-known thought that the experience of scent is the most powerful of all the senses. And I think that the storing, and what some people refer to as the lizard brain or a primal brain, might be even more powerful and more capable of storing scent than other things.
Right.
I just wanted to ask you a question about something you and I texted about the other day. And there's a lot of questions for you tonight, so let me just ask you this one or talk briefly about this. I sent Darren an obscure, as I do, as he'll tell you, I will send him obscure scent questions, obscure requests, and I'll say something like, I'm thinking about hydrogen today, and I don't remember the exact text, but I said I was having an experience where I thought hydrogen, if you could see it, would look like a fine lace made out of glass.
Right.
And what would that smell like? And this is what I bother him with in the middle of the day. And often early in the morning.
By the way.
Yeah, thank you. Often early in the morning because I haven't slept at all, or on a weekend. And his response back, we were talking back and forth about what therefore would that smell like. And you had said something about what to avoid because it would just smell like a commercial perfume. Do you remember what you were talking about?
I do. I remember that, yeah.
And the point I was making was he was able to cut out of the equation immediately 2 or 3 things that should not be used because there is a sort of almost a cultural universal of thinking of those as sort of high commercial men's cologne scents.
Right.
So not only on the individual level are we experiencing these profound connections with scents, but they have sort of a society of control over us in a lot of ways. And if you go into a restaurant, it better smell like food and not like floor cleaner.
Right.
So, and then of course that's a very basic one, but it's we're looking at a broader gaze here. So what can we do with sorcery that taps into this universal energy? And that's what I want to talk about that. I know there's a couple of other questions for you, Darren, but let's go back to that in a minute. Victor, did you have a question for Darren?
Yes, I was wondering, Darren, can we possibly separate taste when we're talking about scents? Because the two of them are so intertwined.
That's an excellent question. You really can't. Research has shown that somewhere between 70 and 80% of that which we perceive to be taste is actually smell. As far as taste goes, really the only things that we can taste is salty, sweet, bitter, and it was thought to just be those 3. Recently they've added another taste receptor that they have found on the tongue that's called umami, which is sort of a savory, meaty taste, basically anything that contains glutamine. So when you think about eating a meal or enjoying a glass of wine or chocolate or coffee, 70 to 80% of what you're experiencing is actually smell. It's not taste at all. And we've all experienced it whenever you have a head cold and you're all stuffed up and then you go to eat something, you can't taste anything. So, yeah, it's really difficult to separate the two.
This number 70% comes up a lot. If the universe is 70% dark matter and 70% of what we're experiencing as taste is really scent, this kind of number comes up quite often. When we talk about sorcery and we talk about dark matter and it being everywhere, and I often say, when I'm teaching or when I'm working on my own sorcery, that you have to tap into that largest portion of that which will connect you from your point in your mind to your target. So how do we involve scent in that? Because this is a really powerful opportunity to talk about this. when I'm trying to communicate with somebody who's 5,000 miles away and get them to stop doing whatever they're doing, I'm more often than not using behavioral tactics. Energy's connecting to behavior, energy's connecting to intentional roadblocks that I'm putting up. But what if we really started to involve their memory of scent in that? What do you think about that? Anybody?
Well, since it takes up such a big part of your brain, I would imagine that if we could tune into more of the scent, you'd have more, I guess, energy is what I'm looking for, behind what we're doing. I mean,
yeah, it's untapped. It's untapped. Go ahead.
Right. I mean, that's a big, that's almost like flipping a switch on a 220 line. I mean, that should really boost up whatever you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it, it's probably not that hard. I mean, you can use general things like, you know somebody's in California, okay, then you think of the smell of pot and the smell of the beach. It should, get you close to California. And if it's in San Francisco, you think of patchouli, and that smells like dirty hippies. So you're doing fine.
Those are very specific examples, Chris. Something you want to tell us?
Yeah.
Well, you're talking about memory of scent. So, I mean, what you're saying is your experience of things that you perceive to be those combinations, and how powerful is that? That's tremendous. If you think of it, you want to talk to somebody. I have a student who lives in Montana, and she's always talking about, she just got married. She's not from here. She's always talking about how moving there has made her want to become a vegetarian because she knows what comes out of cow. And she was a city girl. She lived in Baltimore, Oregon before this. And, she's constantly talking to me about scent now. This stinks, that stinks. I hate it here, this kind of thing. And I said to her, understand you're standing alongside people who don't smell any of that anymore. And this is such a wide chasm. It's an interesting story because it's a very wide chasm for her. She cannot even grasp how that's possible. So what happens to scent that makes us store it or not experience it? I mean, Darren, you have thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I do. My experience has been, and I've been experimenting a lot recently with scent and sorcery and how the two can be integrated, and it's really become difficult for me to separate the two because it just seems so natural. But, when you smell something and you have a memory of it, a memory is triggered, it's retrieved and brought back, it's not even just a memory. It puts you back in that moment because it is such a visceral experience, and you're experiencing it, through the limbic brain, through that filter. So it's not just a cognitive, idea of that experience. You're actually re-experiencing it, just not physically. And what happens is you're not only just tapping into that memory, you're tapping into that energy. You're tapping into where you were energetically at that place and time when when whatever it was happened, that experience happened.
Do you think
and then you bring that back into your current experience.
Sorry. Do you think people experience scent the same way? Like, people are always questioning whether or not we experience color the same way. Do you think that you and I smell, pine needles the same way?
Physiologically, when we take the first sniff, the olfactory cortex does pick up certain molecules, and there are certain scent receptors that are triggered. But from that point on, it goes into the filter of your brain, and it taps into every experience you have. So, for example, when you smell pine needles, you smell it first, your brain, says this smells, piney, this smells like it's an evergreen scent. It's a pine needle, and then you associate that with maybe Christmas trees or, being in the forest. And then what happens, and it happens subconsciously, is that your brain reaches out into all of those, virtual file cabinets of every time you have smelled pine And so it makes an association with every one of his experiences and taps into all of that energy. And this is happening without us even knowing. And this is why it's exciting to me, because if we know that's going on and we know that we have that capability, then imagine how powerful that could be if we were to use that to our advantage in sorcery.
So at the ritual level, I want to talk to Chris about this as well. At the ritual level, when there is a formula to use a particular oil, and let's just say for the sake of this conversation that oil is appropriate for the particular ritual, leaving its pedigree alone for a minute. And the reason it's written that way is because for the person who wrote it, that experience created enough thought triggers to make some kind of manipulation of energy happen, which is why I just asked Darren if we are experiencing, and thank you for that, Darren. I didn't realize that at least the initial jump we are physiologically experiencing it the same way. So, Chris, you do a lot of work with materials, root work and whatnot, and how does the combination of things and the requirements for oils fit into your work in that way?
Well, I use them both as like a trigger for myself and a trigger for the people that I'm working on. A lot of times to relax or to, put the person at ease or just to have something other than a sterile environment. I mean, I found that mugwort, frankincense, dragon's blood, and patchouli work really good. To me, they help with the experience. They get me in the right mindset to where I'm supposed to be. It's like, okay, I walked in the room, that's what I smell, that's where I focus. Everything else goes away. I'm in where I'm supposed to be. And it also helps the... What?
I was just going to say, are you saying that helps on your side? Because what you said was so interesting about the trigger being for you and for the others and how that works. Are you saying that those particular elements work well for you to put you in a space to do energy manipulation?
It does both of us. For me, it puts me in the mindset that I'm supposed to be. I mean, everybody's got their own little thing. It's just something that you have that's special, that when you do the work, this is what you got. It's just a favorite something. It could be a piece of jewelry, it could be, something that you drink, whatever, before you do the ritual that puts you in the right mindset. It also helps with the person that I'm working on because it takes away the feeling of this being a sterile environment, that something is going to happen. Their mind's already set to the fact that, okay, something's going on. This is going to be something that happens to me. This seems to be like where I'm supposed to be at this time, and it opens their minds to it. And it helps a whole lot with the work that I do. I mean, it can get done without it, but it takes longer, and it's a lot more productive if their minds can open up and be relaxed while I'm trying to work.
Mm-hmm. So you're using the materials to create the entire overall environment for both of you. What do you do if the person's not with you?
Then that takes a little bit longer. I'll fall back on some of the older tactics that they use in powwow, which is I rely on their religion. Mm-hmm. A lot of times they're Christian, so I fall back into the things that, doing this in the name of God, and I go through all the chants and all the stuff that's supposed to do that, and that helps to relax them for most of the time. If they find out that I'm sanctioned by God, it makes everything wonderful. Whatever. Do you ever say to people, I want you to have the experience of the smell of roses? Because I've done a lot of work where I'm at extraordinary distance with some people and trying to involve scent in when it's important. I've done that when people are trying to connect to lost people.
if someone calls me and someone is missing, and I feel that the person, whether they're alive or they're part of the disincarnate, it doesn't matter. The process is often similar. I'll say, well, that, you know, what is a scent that relates that person to you, in your what connects you, and then we work through experiencing the scent. They don't even have to be there next to me, which is even better, actually, because then they're truly pulling the scent out of their primitive brain. Have you tried that?
Well, I've had people that I've talked to that, you know, how do I get in touch with so-and-so? And I'll tell them about, well, you can put out favorite food, tobacco, you know, something like that. And I explain to them that even though they can't eat and they can't drink, it's the whole idea of they can enjoy the smell, which takes it all back to, again, that smell is so much percentage of what we taste. So it's like you can almost eliminate a certain part of the taste. As long as you have the smell, you can still enjoy it.
You know, the disincarnate has said to me on many, many, many occasions that they don't remember how to taste. They have an understanding of the memory of a tactile touching experience. They have a memory of bleeding. They have a memory, and by memory I mean something that they can understand and recreate if you help them in that procedure. They remember what things sounded like, what things smell like, but taste seems to elude them. So in that sense, this 70-30, and I know, Darren, those numbers were loose, but just to look at that for a minute, of how much of taste is really scent, for the disincarnate, that aspect is removed, and it becomes really, truly 100% scent. So for them, it's extremely powerful because it isn't less because they can't taste. They remember it all through the sense of scent.
Mm. If you think about it, I mean, now it will be a little inconvenient, but say you lost 30% of your little finger, you're not going to be totally incapacitated. So if you would lose 30% of your taste function, but you're still left with 70, you can still enjoy a good percentage of what you enjoyed before. And if you look at some of the things that we put out for the deceased and for ancestors and things like that, it's not plain things. You're not putting toast on the altar. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's always things
right.
that have a strong smell. You know, like I said, tobacco. I mean, you can't get much stronger than that. Alcohol. Now, how many times do we use that in trying to summon somebody? You know, we use stronger smelling foods. It's nothing that milk toast that we put out for these people to come back and enjoy. So there is a connection there. You know, there's got to be. It just makes too much sense.
Victor, did you want to add in on this? Did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, a couple of things. Interesting the point you just made about the disincarnate not remembering or not having taste. I'm in the process right now of dealing with a very elderly mother-in-law and an elderly mom. And these women were both foodies. They love to eat. They love food. They love the taste of food. They love the smell of food, everything about food for forever. And in the last few years, as they're getting closer to the end of their earthly existence, their desire for food has diminished. They don't want to eat anymore. They eat just enough to survive. And so I wonder if there's a connection between that disconnect with the desire to eat and taste that results in when the disincarnate has no remembrance or recollection of taste. Just something I'm throwing out there if anyone wants to jump on that. And I have one other thing to follow up on with something that Darren had said before.
Well, I'll tell you that the number 70-30 has really gotten my attention tonight because it's something that I maybe I've never spoken about. You know, I have so much experience with the disincarnate that sometimes I don't know if I've even told a tip of what they've told to me. And a number of them have said to me, well, that was the point at which I stopped eating. And I've explored that a little bit, and they say, well, I said, well, what is that? And they say, well, that's the point at which we know, at which you know is where it's going, and not that you don't know your whole life that that's where it's going, but that there's sort of like death has moved in a little bit. I remember the woman I talk about as my grandmother would look at her hands and she'd say, "Oh, here it comes." She said to me she had death hands, and it's a similar kind of thing. And the disincarnated, quite a number of them have said to me, well, because I ask questions and I say things like, "When did you know? When did you know that this is now, that you're now entering that portion of your experience, that death is coming and it is, and the event is going to occur in real time, and that you're going to be part of that within a reasonable amount of time?" And they say, well, many of them have referred to it as the time when they've stopped really eating. So there's enough data there to really connect this concept that they don't taste anymore to that experience.
Fascinating. Yeah. And getting back to Darren's point before about the association, memory association involved with scent, without going into explanation of why, the safest place I ever felt as a child was with my grandmother in my grandmother and grandfather's house. And she was an amazing cook, well into her 80s, early 90s. And if I ever smell the types of food that she used to cook, a lot of this was European, as soon as I have that smell, I feel safe, I feel secure, I feel grounded instantly without anything else happening. So that programming, that connection between that scent of that food and the sense of security, the sense of being loved, the sense of being protected is so powerful in me that just that little bit of a smell of some of that food will trigger that association immediately. It's an instantaneous reaction. And one other very strong memory association I have, and I think Darren can comment on this, has to do with the pheromones. My first real love, my first true love, first girl I fell in love with head over heels when I was in my teens, had a specific scent to her skin. It was something that I rarely smell, if ever. And once I was walking past someone, and she had that same smell to her, and it really just threw me back to that first love and that connection to that girl's, the scent of that beautiful young girl's skin. It was just amazing.
Well, the scent of human skin is an enormously powerful experience. And there are, and this is the question I have for Darren as well, I think that some of us have a nose, if you will. Some of us can really have that experience of scent and be able to define it. My daughter can stand next to someone and remember forever what they smell like. Not their perfume, not the detergent that they clean their clothes with. She remembers their scent. And she will say to me, that person's scent has changed. And she'll become very suspicious. So she has this ability to pick up the actual sense of human skin in that way, at a really amazing and profound level. Darren, do you have anything you want to add to about that kind of an experience?
No, I think that she should take up perfumery.
Yeah,
because that's a very subtle.
Yeah, she's mentioned that to you. She wants to do that.
Right.
To take a look at that, because she can remember a scent forever. I mean, even to the point where if she sees a product and we buy the same product 6 months later, she'll say to me, they changed the formula. She'll just know.
Yeah.
At the most subtle tones, they go into what you call those filing cabinets forever. They never seem to go away.
Right.
What do you... Let's talk for a second about the boxes. This is a technique we use in sorcery. Because even though all the listeners are not necessarily studying sorcery, this is what I do, and therefore this is what I talk about. Mm-hmm. And I want to explore a little bit about how we move scent around and how we can deal with that. And I think that Darren wanted to mention something about that.
Yeah, I did. I've been experimenting with scent and the boxes, and it's been, for me at least, working extremely well. With scent being such a trigger and connecting us to a specific point in time and tapping into the energy of that time, it's the perfect opportunity for moving through time. If you have an event in the past that, has caused you trauma, you can, through the use of the boxes and scent, go back in time to that experience and supplant an olfactory trigger that will give you a different result and can change, the entire fabric of that experience and of your story. So I've been experimenting with that and just choosing a scent and basically charging it through sorcery with your intention or your desire, and then using that scent as a trigger, as sort of like an olfactory touchstone of sorts. And it can even be used in the future. You can take a scent like, say, sandalwood, for example, and, burn sandalwood incense and wear sandalwood oil and, to bathe in sandalwood soap and really just immerse yourself in that scent to the point where you don't even have to be in the presence of sandalwood, but if you just think about it, you can smell it. And that's one of the powerful things of the limbic brain is that, and we've all done this. I mean, if you think of like the smell of rotten fish, you can smell it even though it's not in front of you. So it's a very powerful, deep-rooted experience that we have. So if you take a scent, charge it with your intention and your desire, you can move it through time on your timeline, and you can put it in the future and, infuse it with, strength and courage and the feeling of being impermeable, so that if something does come up in the future that you need to tap into that energy, it's there for you.
Darren, when I came up with the concept of the boxes, I can tell you exactly how that happened. It was a lot of years ago, and I walked into a place that had a fire. And this place was someplace that I had visited years before that and was holding a very good memory for me. Mm-hmm. And since that experience, I had gone back and there had been a fire, and it smelled like sort of not even just a fire, but the remnants of decay and that kind of thing. And I was very much involved in building my method of sorcery at the time, and I thought, I'm going to take this and I'm going to put this either way in the future or before I had the other experience. So I had to decide whether I was going to take this experience of smelling this place in disrepair and put it previous to me enjoying the place, in which case I would challenge my timeline to understand that I had a memory later of it being repaired, which was backwards from what happened, but we're talking about sorcery now. We're talking about changing our timeline. Or put it so far into the future that it would not happen in my lifetime in this vessel, in this body, on this planet. And from that moment came the study of the boxes. I spent about 3 years using them almost exclusively so that I could grasp them and teach it the way that I do, because the boxes, and maybe we should talk about that on the radio at some time, more like not really a class, but talk about the components of what I call the Iron Ring, which is really all of the components of blood sorcery, the way that I see them and work them and teach them. But you are absolutely right. You can plug in these the most extreme, the memories that hit us the hardest, the things that we hold on to the most, because the boxes are really the highest frequency of the science of blood sorcery. Mm-hmm. They are. There's nothing we can't do or change. We can change the past. We could change people's perception of what happened in the past with the boxes. So plugging in this incredibly powerful experience of the olfactory response, and it's more than a memory. It's a response. It's visceral. Like you were saying, we have the initial first breath, but then we take it to everywhere else that it could possibly be. I mean, when I smell anything that smells decomposed at all, I remember that there was one moment when I was at the medical examiner's office where one of the decomposed bodies was someone I actually had known. And, you stay in a place like that long enough in the city you grew up in, that will happen. And so it always takes me back to that moment first, and then, of course, it expands into other things. But, yes, the boxes, brilliant. Do you have anything else you want to add to that, Darren? If not, I'm going to ask Chris what his story. He has a story he wants to tell regarding scent.
Just one quick comment that came to mind after something you said about your response to the olfactory trigger. That does have a lot to do with it, because when you smell something, it's not just the memory that is being triggered. It's the energy, but then from re-experiencing that energy, physically what happens is the brain actually releases chemicals in response to that. So there's a chemical response. So it's actually changing your brain chemistry. And I mean, researchers have done functional MRIs where they have had people smell different scents and watch, how it changes their brain chemistry. So, again, it's something very, very useful for sorcery.
Well, if you look at that in the visceral response, there are things that make us nauseous. You smell something and you immediately feel nausea. Now, nothing is going into your body to change your chemistry in your digestive tract, so it must be something that's happening, like you're saying, where there's a physiological response to knowing that this is perhaps toxic or this is something that you shouldn't eat, of course. And it goes back to a more primitive mammalian response to coming across that which is not good for us and learning to not ingest it or run away. Victor, do you have something you want to add to that?
No, just saying that I had an experience, working in the industry that I work in. We sell compressed gases. And about 20 years ago, there was a tank of hydrogen sulfide on our loading dock that leaked. And it didn't take long for the odor to get, and it wasn't a significant leak, it was a very small discharge of hydrogen sulfide gas. And I got violently sick just from that small exposure smell, in terms of nausea, vomiting, just a revulsive reaction to it. So it's very powerful. And again, the hydrogen sulfide in and of itself was not causing it. It was the body's reaction to that brief smell.
Wow, there's so much here to apply to sorcery. My head is spinning. Chris, did you want to tell us about an experience that you had with Sun?
Yeah, I had, years ago, I worked in a garage, third shift by myself. And I went into the parts room to pick up some parts that was the truck I was working on, and I caught the whiff of a men's cologne. And it's like, okay, what the hell is this? I'm supposed to be the only one there. Everything's locked up. Who the hell's in here? And I followed that around. Now, at the time, I had a nice-sized wrench in my hand. And I followed the scent around upstairs through a cutout that was up there that led back in a different part. I'm like, where the hell was this guy going? And it's like you could just follow the scent. And when I finally came to the end, it was in one of the offices. So I'm thinking, oh, shit, somebody broke in there looking for money. And just as the door opened, I almost clubbed the owner of the company on the top of the head because I didn't expect him in there at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Well, he was wearing cologne. Should we ask what he was doing?
Yep.
We're okay with that.
That's what it was. It was just to follow
sure.
that it was that strong that this didn't belong there. It's like this was a garage. This is how it's supposed to smell. And that little bit threw everything off.
That is really what scent does for us. It can create a situation where we know that there's something to be concerned about. We've all smelled smoke. We've all been in a situation where we know that something is not quite right. Mary, you have a thought about warnings, the scent of warning?
Yeah, I was just thinking, when Chris was talking about that, it's like that warning smell, that smell that's coming at you that all of a sudden something doesn't seem right and you have to kind of take notice of it. So it heightens the other senses to a certain degree, kind of gets you on guard.
Victor, to that point, I wanted to ask you, you had mentioned the hydrogen sulfide. How long did it take you to come back from that? Because in sorcery, everything is based on time as well and how we experience it. What were you saying?
I'm going to say it had to be at least an hour. When I was getting sick, at first I yelled to someone to get a mask, put a mask on, go out and shut the thing down or check the valve or lock the valve up in some way. But I then went to the bathroom, and I remember splashing my face with water. I remember gargling with water. I remember trying to clear the horrible taste out. I'm going to say at least an hour, perhaps an hour and a half.
And this is entirely without actually ingesting. I mean, there is a certain amount of ingesting that one does when taking in a scent, but this is without ingesting. if you take this concept and you put it in the boxes and you put it in a place where sorcery works for you and put it on your timeline and say, well, now I'm going to take this concept that scent is so powerful that it changes our physiology or our moment of experiencing our physiology and move it around, you now have a brand new sorcery tool that you had not particularly explored before. One of the things that I wanted to talk a little bit about is the disincarnate and what I call the scent of blood. And this brings us back for a minute to the scent iron that Darren created for this work. Darren, what in the scent brings us to blood? Can you talk about how it's built? Because I want to talk about baiting the disincarnate with blood and how that actually works.
Sure. There were two basic notes that I was trying to get across when we developed iron, and it was the scent of iron, the scent of metal, and particularly the scent of metal on your skin. If you have, wrapped a bunch of pennies or dealt with a lot of coinage, and then you smell your hands, it has that metallic smell. Because really, if you just pick up a piece of iron and smell it, it has no smell, but it's the smell that reacts with your skin that we perceive to be the smell of metal. So there was the element of iron, and then the element of blood, which again has iron in it, among other biological elements. And these two together, would be a very powerful way of getting the attention of the disincarnate. So when I created this scent, I just kept those two things in the forefront of my mind. And it's not it's not by any means something that you would wear out on a date. It's not a perfume.
No, it is not. Well, I guess it matters on who you're going on a date with.
Well, that's true. Yeah, who you're trying to get. Yeah.
It is a very powerful trigger that you've made, and then it sort of dissipates after a while. So I guess it's safe to wear in that way. But I discovered that when I had it on my skin, that it dissipated, but that much later, if my skin was moist at all, I could smell it again.
Sort of like the lingering smell of blood on your skin.
Yes, which I'm very, very familiar with. You might have guessed.
And it's interesting when I was developing this, I'm always looking for input from other people because I don't want it to be just my experience. It has to work for other people as well. So I had a bunch of people smell it, and I didn't tell them what it was for, and it was sort of devious on my part. But I said, I'm working on this new fragrance. What do you think? And everybody had such a visceral reaction to it, and they said, that smells like blood, or that smells like metal and blood. And it was across the board. And one person in particular who smelled it and who has no association with sorcery, he doesn't study sorcery or anything, smelled it and he said, what is that? And then he stopped for a second and he said, and why does everything around me feel like it's vibrating?
Because you're a genius.
Well, for me, when I smell it, it sort of like pulls me right into the static practice.
There's the more people that we bring onto the show and have these conversations with who have studied the work that I've authored and have become proficient at it, the more words like the static practice get thrown around. And although listeners might not know what that is, olfactory triggers are vital and can certainly bring us to these kinds of places in a powerful and profound way. And it's of course, I've gotten to the point where I can just pull these scents forward in my mind, if you will, and utilize them. But using iron in this way has been a very unique experience for me because it reminds me of the complexity of the smell. And the longer I do the work, I think that the complexity starts to fade a little bit. And this has brought that back for me, which has been extraordinary. So when you said somebody felt that it was vibrating, what was your thoughts on that? Because I have some thoughts on that. What did you think that meant?
Well, as you know, when one experiences blood or their perception of blood, it triggers a very deep emotional and psychological response because we're not supposed to be experiencing that outside of our body.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I was assuming that it was just they were having a moment, where they were standing on that line in the static practice and feeling this, the void, and then also this chaos, this energetic vibration.
Well, this is what happens. It doesn't matter how long you do this. You can do this for decades and decades like I have, or you can be new at this. When you interrupt the vessel holding the blood in and you create a situation where you're bleeding, there is that primitive part of your brain that wants to repair it right away, that considers it danger. And the energy that comes from that is what brings us to the static practice. So this scent of blood in the air, of what really feels like human blood, it smells like human blood, is extremely powerful and can bring people to the static practice. But then what would be extraordinary is if they could use iron, and if you get some, you'll find this experience. It's on Cagliastro, theironring.com if anybody wants to try it out. If you have this experience, you can put it in one of those file cabinets in your memory, as Darren so eloquently offered us that term, and you can then be able to call upon it because it might give you a stronger feeling of your own blood than taking in the scent of your own blood. Victor, your thoughts?
Just a really funny thing. Just the discussion, the memory of that hydrogen sulfide experience started making me queasy and started bringing me back that state of dizziness I felt and nausea that I felt.
What if you wanted to use that to get someone's attention from a distance? Maybe someone you felt
certainly
was in
creating
danger.
the chaos.
Yeah. Imagine
Yeah.
Imagine if you felt someone was in danger and you wanted to use sorcery to share with them this experience. Now, everybody who breathed in that particular thing, I think you said it was hydrogen sulfide, would be having a similar experience. So therefore, there's a thing called hydrogen sulfide that human beings should not be breathing in. If you utilize that in sorcery, if you utilize that moment of you having that experience in sorcery, and you were able to use it even in directional sorcery to send something with expeditiously elsewhere so that somebody else could have that experience and have them see that as danger so they left the area that they're in. I mean, the way that you can use sorcery is exponential. I think Mary had something she wanted to add or something to the chat room.
Yeah, we were talking in here about different scents, and someone had commented that he worked for more than a decade around photochemicals and became really desensitized to the very strong smell of them. Other scents didn't bother him, and he could smell a lot of them very clearly, but he started to pick up those as, quote, normal. They were just kind of a normal smell. And so I'm wondering, as far as desensitization to certain scents or smells, how that would affect, the sorcery or the type of work that we're doing. So I wanted just to lob that out there.
Well, I have thoughts on that. Anybody else want to take it first?
Well, like I said, I was a mechanic for all those years. But if you walk away for a long enough time, like say a couple days, and you come back, you still smell it. And when something, like I said, that whole story was when something doesn't smell right. Just because you're not acknowledging it doesn't mean you don't smell it. You might...
Chris, that's very powerful. Go on. I love that you said that. Go ahead. Because you're not acknowledging it doesn't mean that.
Yeah, just because you think you don't smell it anymore, you get sensitized to pain after a while, too. It doesn't make it go away. It just means that, you don't feel it anymore. Something else filled that in, but it's still there. Just like with all the chemicals I worked around in a garage, I could still smell if something was leaking fuel. I could smell if there was an antifreeze leak, and I could still, to this day, that sticks in my head. It's just as much as it was there, if it was more than what I was used to, I could still smell it.
So you could use it to diagnose situations.
Right.
knowing what they
You know,
smell.
if the truck would run in, they go, oh, my truck's not running right. Well, it smells like fuel. You're leaking fuel.
Mhm.
You know, are you sure? I don't even have to pop the hood. I can smell it. You know, same way with antifreeze. You know, it's like, yeah, you're leaking antifreeze. How do you know? Because it stinks.
That's
you know,
very interesting.
Just like when I was in the service, we used to go every year, sometimes twice a year. We would go for nuclear, biological, and chemical training. And every time we went through the tear gas chamber. You will never, ever, ever forget what tear gas smells like once you get it up your nose one time. And to this day, I still know what that smells like.
Yep.
Yeah, well, there are scents that never leave us. And before I was talking about being around decomposition, when I say that I've spent my entire life in service to the disincarnate, I mean that in every way. I've worked in every aspect of the industries of dealing with the disincarnate, both at the funeral director side, trade embalmer side, and lending my services to medical examiner's office and whatnot, and now in full service of the disincarnate in this way. And there's two things that I want to mention about that. I can smell dead when nobody else can smell dead. I can smell if there is a small animal nearby. When my husband has his own pest control company, and he's around these kinds of materials all the time, and I will still smell things before he will. I know from a ridiculous distance the smell of what I call the smell of dead, which is not death; it's decomposition. And it's a good thing I'm in a life's work where this kind of thing is useful, because when I deal with, for example, trying to help someone find the body of someone, what I do is I connect that and send it out there into where I think it should be focused, whether it, whatever direction it is, this kind of thing. So these kinds of scents that sort of rig themselves in your mind in a way that you can never, ever get rid of can be very, very useful, as well as challenging in some ways, because like what the experience Victor was having where he was feeling a little nauseous again from having a reflection back to that. But I had a discussion started a discussion with Darren about doing some incenses. And incense is an interesting thing because you have to burn it. So it has to go through a secondary process to really be explored. And I'm raising these moths now from, anyone who knows me is probably already tired of the moths. But the moths are part of a process bringing me from raising something all the way through its various stages, and then using the live moths in necromancy, not killing them, but letting them be part of the experience. And then when they die, naturally using their wings in an incense. This is what my intention is for them. And now I have several that have gone through their cycle, and they are now no longer alive, and I have their wings. And I've asked Darren to start to think about what a necromancy incense would be, what's in it, what those tones would be, and what would bring us to the place where both from, as Chris was saying, the practitioner's side and the client, if you will, side, and the client might be the individual who's disincarnated, and just using that term as a placeholder for who I'm talking about in the equation. So, Darren, you had some thoughts about what would go in a necromancy incense, and then, we could talk about what having a deceased the wings of a deceased moth that had been through a ritual in it might trigger. You want to talk about that?
Sure. I was just, using my knowledge of, perfumery and, what different scents go together, as well as both traditionally accepted scents that one would associate with the disincarnate or the experience of death, as well as some things that came to me through divination. And I came up with a tentative recipe, I guess you would say, that did include the moth wings. And it also includes material that is the actual smell of soil. It's the smell of like wet, damp soil, graveyard dirt. Mm-hmm. Because although using graveyard dirt in incense, as far as the magical properties and the energy that it brings with it is effective, it really has no smell. So if we're talking about scent triggers, then that would be something that we would want to experience to bring us to that place and to the energy of that experience.
Mm-hmm. And we had also talked about some elements, like you were just saying, that are traditionally accepted as elements around death, around the disincarnate, and that is not to be discarded, because if there are some, they say there are no cultural universals, but people know that fire means that something's happening, the smell of fire. It doesn't necessarily always mean danger, it might mean cooking, but they know that something is changing. So if there are any cultural universals whatsoever, it might be something like the scent of flowers, funerary flowers, if you will, having something to do with the process of awake or someone becoming disincarnate. So what are the things that you were thinking about, and, not to give it all away, but with one or two elements. I had added one, you had some that we talked about. Are there any that draw to the front line on that for you that represent those sort of cultural accepted scents that bring people to the trigger of the disincarnate?
Yeah, that's a great question. Basically, in every culture, there are differences as far as flowers go. Here in the United States, we tend to use roses and carnations. Every time I smell carnation, I'm automatically in a funeral home, in my mind.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But if you were, say, in India, then the floral choices would be different. It may be jasmine or nag champa or frangipani. So, there are some differences, but there are some universals, I think, especially when dealing with the resins. Things like benzoin or copal or myrrh or frankincense. These are scents that we, as a human experience, tend to associate with death and funerals. Various churches, they use it to sense the casket during the funeral mass or at the burial site. So these types of things are something that everyone can sort of plug into.
That's absolutely true. As you know, I've done quite a bit of mummification. And myrrh is a huge portion of the toolkit to deal with the scent of decomposition. When salt hits flesh, it creates desiccation and dries the flesh out, but it doesn't know that it's supposed to also take the scent out. That's wishful thinking. So, which I don't even accept as a possibility. So you have to put in something else, and myrrh somehow gets a communication between the decomposing flesh and the salt, and sort of takes away some of the power of that scent of decomposition. And this is, there is no Egyptian manual on mummification, which is why it took me years to figure out a formula that would work for that process. But there is definitely evidence that myrrh and frankincense and these kinds of things were used because they are such heavy resins, and they participate both in the overcoming, to some extent, of the sense of the meerkaps, which is what appears during this decomposition, and for compensating for the quick desiccation that the salts are causing. So I agree with you that there are definitely some of those kinds of cultural universals, if you will. Darren?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And also, you have to, realize that although I'm not one to be told, this herb means that and this oil means that, there is, a cultural acceptance of certain scents as being a part of a certain experience and therefore holding a certain energy. Mm-hmm. So if for thousands of years people have associated the energy of death with myrrh or frankincense or benzoin, then, and you tap into that and become a part of that, then you have this storehouse of energy at your disposal that is already honed and focused, at the intended result that you're looking to achieve.
There is a question that Mary has for us. Mary, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. This is a question from Allison, and she's just wondering about a mixture to capture like a moon scent, a lilac and lavender night scent, and the scent of a thunderstorm, including the lightning and thunder and rain scents. Is it possible to be put together, or could be put together as separate scents? She was just kind of wondering, as far as nature scents, I guess, how would that be captured, or could it be?
It's going to bring you back to hydrogen, Darren. Go ahead.
yes, we were already going in that direction.
Lace glass, what does that smell like?
Yeah. Yes, it definitely can be done. Those types of what I call elemental fragrances, like the smell of fresh cut grass or rain. I work also in the cosmetic and personal care industry, and I had worked on a commercial fragrance called After the Rain, and it was supposed to smell like the scent when you walk outside after a rainstorm, like the smell of like wet pavement and like wet leaves and just sort of that wet after the rain smell. Those types of scents are very difficult to replicate because it's not like, rose petals that you can just extract, the aromatic components out of, or lavender that you can get an essential oil out of. These are an olfactory experience, and they're a mixture of many different chemicals that we perceive to be the smell of, a rainstorm or the ocean or, grass. So it can be done. It's tricky, and it involves a lot of trial and error and a lot of research into what various aroma chemicals need to be used, because these smells are not available, even though it's ironic because they come from nature. There's no plant that just exudes this essence that can be distilled. So
and if we wanted to use that in sorcery, we would have to rely on memory triggers then.
Right. Right.
And in sorcery, there is no difference in if you really understand what sorcery is. There's no difference between scenting yourself, putting something on your arm, smelling it, or putting it on an incense and burning it, and having the memory of that when you use the boxes and you use directional sorcery. However, when you don't yet have that skill, or you don't have an actual sense memory of what that scent was, then that is when using the actual sense is vital. Victor, did you want to talk about fear or some experience of a particular experiment you were talking about in the chat?
It never ceases to amaze me that whenever I've joined, when you welcome me to your show, that I've had knowledge brought to me that very day that is pursuant to the show. It's really funny. But I was listening to a radio report this morning where they were talking about a study that was done at Emory University School of Medicine, where they found that particular smells may be passed down genetically, in particular the smell of fear. And there was a couple of questions that had come up about the smell of fear. And basically what they did was they found that rats who had been associating the smell of cherries with an electric shock, that future generations of the rats, when exposed to the smell of the cherries, would have a fear response. And that this whole concept of genes being turned on and off, and perhaps Darren can address this more scientifically, that the comment was that mouse memory inheritance may revitalize Lamarckism. Are you familiar with that, Lamarckism, Darren?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What is that?
Basically, what you're describing to me, it's really interesting because it totally set me off in another direction of thought here. But fear, typically, when we have a fear response, we give off pheromones. And, we see that in the animal kingdom all the time. The lion seeks out the weakest, gazelle, because it's reeking of fear, because it's giving off pheromones. So this is actually interesting, this research, which I have not, I'd like you to send me that because I'd like to read this.
Absolutely.
But, it seems like it's sort of working in reverse. It's like reverse evolution.
Well, it's reverse in so much as it reflects back to the previous generation's experience, but it does pay forward if, in fact, now cherries are not something one needs to be afraid of, but if it pays forward to other things that would create a safety issue for particular individuals. When bodies came into the medical examiner's office, or bodies that I had embalmed in for funeral homes, you could smell a difference on individuals who were, pretty much walking out of their house and wound up hit by cars, or walking out and were attacked and murdered, or individuals who were perhaps held hostage and died after a long experience of torture. They smelled differently from one another. And I, who have a fairly good perception, not as good as my daughters, but a fairly good perception of those kinds of human scent recognitions, could absolutely smell it. And I remember saying to a guy who had been working there for 20 years, I said to him, what does that smell? And he said, oh, there's a couple of homicide victims today. It's the smell of fear. And here we were, in this very medicinal sort of environment, this very sterilized kind of environment. And here was a guy who had all the right life experience in this place to be able to define that for me. It was tremendous. Any thoughts?
I want to go back to the rats. And, you said, Darren, about it being reverse evolution. If you think about it, it might turn out to be actually a protection factor. Mm-hmm. Because if, fear is supposed to smell a certain way, well, if a cat's chasing a mouse and it smells like cherries, the chances are the cat will say, well, I don't want this. So that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean that in a negative way. No, I just find it interesting that, so basically it's setting up the future generations with, a trigger, an olfactory trigger, as a warning.
Mary, your thoughts on it?
Yeah, no, I had read an article about, horses that are being marked for slaughter. They can smell fear and death when it's coming. So it's an interesting, I guess, in an article I read, they were being led that way, and then you could tell they could feel what was coming and they could smell what was coming, just what was in the air that was being given off by the other horses. It's kind of an interesting, phenomenon of that smell being in the air.
Take your dog to the vet.
Yes. Well, yeah, they know it's coming. They know that there is some kind of recognition from the last time they were there. I don't know that they're smelling death if you take your dog to the vet, but they remember that the last time they were here, something happened to them that was not pleasing, and and they smell it right away. My dog knows, when we're going in that direction. He's got a whole other thing going, and I don't think that's sense. I think that's some sense memory and some visual stuff as well. But
Mary,
yes, go ahead.
Mary, is that why horses have long faces?
That's it.
Thank you, Victor.
You're welcome.
Perhaps. I want to talk for a minute about blood sorcery. And, not that I don't talk about blood sorcery pretty much 24 hours a day for the last 3 or 4 decades, but 3.5 decades anyway. But when we talk about blood sorcery, we talk about baiting the disincarnate. I just want to say something about that because I wanted to throw that in. We're not actually talking about them smelling blood. This is not a vampiric experience. This is not an experience where you're baiting them like you bait a trap for an animal to get them to come and bite the meat so the gate closes. And I think this is an important point because being in service of the disincarnate, I feel like I really must make this distinction. It is the experience of the releasing of the blood that allows the disincarnate to, and I want to use the term lightly, smell it, know that it's there, sense it in that way. And then they are drawn to it because they remember what it feels like to sense that in themselves, to smell that in themselves, and to be human again, which is different, of course, than demons, because demons are just looking for the suffering of the cutting of the skin. They're looking for the chaos energy. So I just wanted to mention that when we talk about baiting the disincarnate, and there are many ways to do it with things that they are familiar with, recreating whole moments, bringing that kind of thing in, that the scent of blood is a complex experience for them, not just a scent. The other night in class I was talking about a particular set of sigils that opens the portal to the disincarnate. And it's a very intense thing. It takes many nights to do, and it is something of a profound commitment to opening an eternal portal to being able to communicate with the disincarnate. So far, 4 or 5 students started it and experiencing it, which is very interesting to me. And people are telling me they're having strong visceral experiences from this thing. And what we're doing is there's a whole series of interrupting the skin in so much as harvesting your blood for this experience. And people are having all manner of experiences, physical ones, emotional ones, dream-related ones. People are starting to feel and see the disincarnate in a way through this very powerful set of sigils that have developed to open the portal for people who are not yet able to do that or people who want to enhance that. So this is a direct connection to data that exists about a procedure regarding a certain number of sigils and how to perform these sigils. And I will say perform these sigils because it's a very interactive thing. You're going to be interrupting your skin and bleeding onto these sigils and through these sigils. But I have not ever had anyone do this and not have an experience of opening on some level their communication with the disincarnate. So this is, very much a part of the work that we do. It is a very respectful thing to do and a very powerful thing to do. And sigil work is becoming something that I'm teaching more and more now and talking more and more about. So I want to just open the idea of seeing these shapes and these numbers and having these mathematical exchanges with shape and space and our blood and how that affects the disincarnate. So my question after that extremely long entry is there a visual component to scent? Are there things that we all see when we have when we experience a particular scent? What happens? How do the other senses join in? Because when you take a bite out of something and it's delicious or it tastes terrible, all your other senses kick in. You sort of shut down in a way, or you get really open to the experience. So maybe this is a question for Darren. Do you want to talk about how the other senses join in to sense?
Sure. Again, this is a matter of associations. For me personally, when I smell, and this is, I don't know why, maybe I'm just strange, but when I smell certain smells, I don't necessarily see shapes as much as I see colors.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not always colors that you would typically associate with a particular scent. Not all watery scents I perceive as blue, or not all spicy scents I perceive as red. So for me, I do have another sense that comes into it, but it's my visual representation of a color that I associate with a particular scent.
You should have done some of the stuff I did as a kid. You'd see what the color 9 smells like.
Chris, we all become valuable in our own way. Victor, what do you think about scent and emotion?
I'm a bad example.
I don't think you're a bad example. I think you are a unique example.
Chris, I just want to say that whatever experience we have in life, when we bring it to the fore, and in the process of doing so, share it with others so that others can develop on their path, no matter what the experience was. It's always a beneficial thing.
That's so true. So, human beings think they are each alone and unique in their experience, but just the idea that we share similarities, I mean, that's what makes sorcery work, is the shared similarities, the shared agreed upon connections between triggers and action. Victor, I was asking you, what do you think about scent and emotion?
Oh, absolutely. As I had mentioned before, in my experiences with the smell of my father's cigars and my experience with the smell of my grandmother's cooking, there is such a powerful emotional, visceral and emotional response from both of those that the triggers are definitely there. The smell of my father's cigar evokes two things in me. It evokes fear because, without going into detail, I was afraid of my father when I was younger. And then it evokes, later on in life, it evokes a sense of wisdom and a sense of positive direction. And as I said, with my grandmother's cooking, that scented that wonderful aromas, the wonderful aromas of that kitchen, security, stability, a sense of peace, sense of calm.
Yeah, well, Victor, as you were saying that, I don't know if it's your voice or the powerful stories that you have. I always get like where you are, and I always sort of drift in and out of it for a minute when you tell stories like that. And when you said, and I know it's personal, so I won't lean on it, but the concept of a scent attaching you to being afraid of something or to being cautious. This is something that I use in sorcery quite a bit. When I have clients who are particularly involved in, for example, domestic violence, they're trying to get out of that, I teach them to attach a scent memory of something displeasing so that they can start to develop a break, because people sometimes are, even in a bad situation, are emotionally tethered to one another. So I actually use the idea of the scents that are displeasing to get them to understand the possibility of recoiling as opposed to going towards something.
Mm.
Any ideas? Mary, do we have questions in the chat room?
We do. One of the things was just a little bit more to talk about pheromones. I think folks were interested in hearing a little bit about what everybody's thoughts were on pheromones themselves.
I don't know a great deal about pheromones, and I think that is a very particular niche. But I think that when it comes to human-to-human contact, that they are experienced in a very subtle way. And that I think when you talk about pheromones, you can also talk about what we acknowledged as the smell of fear, per se. And, anyone who knows me knows that I deconstruct fear into inconvenience and confusion so that it's not an actual thing. But even inconvenience and confusion creates a physiological response. People come to me all the time and ask me if I will do the one thing that I will absolutely not do, which is, I hate to even say it, which is love magic.
Break out your pink candles, everyone.
That's right, and your glitter and lavender and whatever else business they sell in Salem.
My question about the love magic is, if you go and you do a spell for somebody like that, how do you know the guy isn't a damn serial killer? And then what the hell do you do once you got a hold of him and he won't leave you alone?
After the fourth and the fifth time that the person asks me for that, I hope he is a serial killer. But that's just my own personal. I'm always looking for a solution, Chris. So to me, that seems like an obvious one.
Well, when they ask me, that's the first thing I say. What are you going to do if you find out he's an asshole or a serial killer?
Well, maybe you'll find out. I don't know. People ask me this all the time. I don't know how you can know me more than 4 seconds and think that this is a particular direction you should ask me to go in for you in terms of work. But people often say to me, well, I have, his or her biologicals. They don't use that language. I do. And I say to them, I don't do this work. And they'll say, well, somebody told me if I put it in oil and I breathe it in and all this business will go on. And so I think that pheromones are a completely separate subject. I think that to talk about them, we would need a specific amount of time and people who are expert in that kind of thing. But it brings me to the discussion, and I know that we're running out of time now, but it brings me to the discussion of the scent of biologicals. And, I tell people all the time to collect biologicals when it comes to particular kinds of work, especially if they're trying to rid someone of their lives that they have an emotional tether to. And I get a lot of clients like that. I get people who can't make themselves leave. And so really the sorcery that I'm doing is on both the decay of the relationship and the individual who is in front of me, who's the client. So we deal with the destruction of biologicals in that way. So the breakdown of scent is very important when it comes to that. We're not using it like an incense. We're using it as something we actually burn and deconstruct in that way. So the element of heat is very interesting to me when it comes to scents. I know that we're running out of time, but is there anybody else who wants to bring in a final comment on this thing? I'm actually going to be off the air in about 7 or 8 minutes. I have, speaking of clients, I have a client that I need to talk to. So, Mary, anything else in the chat room? Anybody have anything else that they want to bring in before Mary starts to bring us out?
Just a quick question about the honey and
honey,
necromantic
right.
associations, yes.
Honey does actually have a use in dealing with the disincarnate and necromancy in general. Honey is an example of a life cycle, how it's made, what the process is, that it is a group effort, this kind of thing. It has an interesting energy to it, and it does not decay. And that's the interesting thing. I know quite a bit about, at least for what's available, about Egyptian usage of various foodstuffs and chemicals and whatnot in their manner of sorcery, if you will. And the idea of everlasting life, or when you look at the actual Book of the Dead, which is really called Book of Going Forth by Day, there are a number of references to honey and its eternity, its essence of being forever. So if you are trying to create a long-term relationship with a member of the disincarnate, honey is absolutely usable. If you want to know how more specifically, I think the thing to do would be to contact me. My email is sorceresscagliastro@gmail.com. I keep that one around, even though I have others, because that's really just about as simple as it gets. Sometimes out of these kinds of shows come more questions than answers. So there is definitely ritual, and there is ritual involving putting your own blood in honey. Remember, I'm a blood sorceress. It's the baseline for most of what I do. So that is what I'm going to add to that. Any other thoughts? Anybody have anything that they want to add?
Victor's back. I actually had a crash on Skype, and I had to just call back on a regular phone. But just very quick comment on pheromones. My wife has been studying human relationships for more than 35 years and a bit of an expert on them. And she's saying pheromones are the worst possible thing because when people meet, if their pheromones react and they get that sense of each other, they could actually fall head over heels in love with the absolute wrong person. So to the point that Darren was making and Chris was making, they can be dangerous.
Yeah, I guess so. Love can be dangerous all the way around. Now I want to do a case study. Now I want to look at some sorcery and see what happened there. And what's interesting about that, Victor, is right now I have 2 clients that have been married more than 20 years each, and they're both going through divorces. And both of them have said to me, I have no idea, they happen to both be men, why I even got involved with her to begin with.
Yep, there's your answer.
And I say, well, what happened? And they both said to me, now they don't know each other, they're completely separate people, and both of them said to me, I don't know, I met her and then I was at the altar. and this kind of thing. And one said that specifically. The other one said, I don't know, I met her and then I was proposing to her. I didn't even like her. And here we are 20 years later. So tell your wife that if there's data on that, I'd love to see it. I find that very interesting. Because the way that I'm handling it, is using the boxes and bringing them to the place before this happened. You were saying?
She used to say that pheromones equal pixie dust.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder if pheromones are just a throwback to an older time where, we needed that in order to reproduce, but we don't need it so much now anymore. Our emotions have become, stronger. We see things. We understand things more. We go more towards falling into relationship and into love instead of just going out and, grabbing somebody and, hey, here we go.
Absolutely.
Well, that goes back to our more primitive state. We're running out of time. I just want to mention something entirely gratuitous plug. The studio, Cagliastro Studio in the Hands of Nine, we will be actually open towards the third week of July. We're looking at the 17th of July for it to be really a public experience. And in this space, we have an enormous opportunity for people to come in and look at how sorcery works in various rooms and whatnot. It's even grander than I had initially perceived it to be. And I would like to perhaps next week talk about the studio and just demystify it. I've gotten hundreds and hundreds of questions about it, so I would like to know if we can perhaps next week talk about it and demystify it. The website that I have now, which is CagliastroTheIronRing.com, will stay up, and soon, very, very soon, there'll be the click over to Cagliastro Studio in the Hands of Nine. And I would love to just have people come and experience all of the different various types of sorcery that I've developed and offered to teach over these years in the studio. And also you can find iron on CagliastroTheIronRing.com. And I want to thank Darren endlessly, not only for his appearance here tonight, but for the incredible attention he pays to detail when he develops these scents. And I'm, publicly insisting that he does 10,000 more of them with me.
I'm in.
All right. It's a deal. It's a deal. Mary, you want to take us out?
Sure. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for this week's edition of the Dark Matters radio show with the Sorceress Cagliastro. To reach the Sorceress, like she said, find her at CagliastroTheIronRing.com. If you'd like to reach Chris Rogue Ostrowski, he can be reached at his email at hellsrogue, HELSrogue, @gmail.com. Me, Shotgun Mary, the producer, can be reached at theshotgunmary@gmail.com. And for our special guests, if you'd like to reach them, Darren Allen White can be reached on his Facebook page, Morbid Mists, or his email at nose@morbidmists.com. And you can reach Victor the Voice Furman at his fan page on Facebook, Victor the Voice Furman. Please follow us on Facebook at the Dark Matters Radio Show with the Sorceress Cagliastro page. And next week, one of our favorite topics, we'll be talking about demons and attending demons. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Mary. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.